the former deputy commissioner, longtime commissioner of the NBA, and also a basketball Hall of Famer and the general manager of the Bulls at the time who drafted Michael Jordan, Rod Thorn, here on the Rich Eisen Show. How are you, Rod?
Doing great, Rich. How are you?
I'm doing fine. I'm sure your phone's blown up in the last 5 weeks, huh?
It definitely has. Yeah, I've had a lot of calls.
I'm sure you have. I have some questions for you, sir, if you don't mind. I appreciate you taking the time to answer them. First things first, did you learn anything from The Last Dance, Rod?
You know, I did, Rich. There were some clips that I'd never seen before. Knowing Michael reasonably well, I thought that he put himself out there a little bit more than I would have expected because, toward the end of his career, he was pretty guarded, in what he said and how he was, wanted himself to be looked at. And that surprised me a little bit. But I think the basic gist of it pretty much covered him. And it was very compelling TV.
It sure was, Rod. Let's go back to the draft period for you. When you were third on the clock, did you get any calls for the trade the pick for somebody who wanted Jordan? Did you get any calls for that?
Rich, not when we were on the clock. We didn't. We had a bunch of calls prior to the draft from teams who were interested in the third pick. I can assume that they were interested in Jordan with that pick, but there were several teams who were interested. There were a couple of teams that were more interested than others, made what I think people would probably call reasonable offers for that particular pick.
Do you remember the names of the teams? Do you remember any of the names of the teams, Rod, that you thought, what?
The two teams who made the better offers were Philadelphia and Dallas.
Okay. What could have been? And you just said, no, thank you. What could have been, and you said, no, thank you.
We knew about a week before the draft that Jordan would be available. Portland, in my conversations with Stu Inman, who was the GM of the Blazers, had told me that if Sam Bowie passed his physical, they would draft him. And about a week before the draft, I called him and asked him if Bowie passed, and he said yes. And I asked him if they were still going to draft him, and he said yes. So we knew a week before the draft that unless some crazy trade or something happens, which sometimes does around drafts, that Jordan would be available at number 3.
So was this a time where people didn't lie about their intentions for a draft, Ron? I mean, you took Stu's word for it there?
No.
Okay.
No.
Right.
But, I knew Stu, very well, and he was not the kind of lie or the kind of guy who was, if he told you, he might tell you it's none of your business or we haven't made up our minds yet. But in this case, he didn't, and he was telling the truth.
So prior to you receiving this information, or potentially in the event that he might have had his lips moving and it wasn't really true, what was your backup plan at number 3 if Jordan was gone? What would you have done?
If Jordan had been gone, we would have taken Sam Perkins. My feeling, Charles Barkley was in that draft.
Mm-hmm.
And my feeling about Barkley, and I scouted Barkley a bunch of times, was that he was too small to do in the NBA what he was doing at Auburn. And, Sam Perkins had a nice career and was a very good player, but that would have been a mistake.
Well, I'm assuming that you spoke to Dean Smith about both Tar Heels. What was your conversation with Dean Smith about Jordan prior to that draft, Rod?
Well, I had developed a relationship with Coach Smith. We'd go down and watch practice from time to time, and at the end of every year, he would allow me to come in and watch his tapes, where you could scout not only the Tar Heels but also the other ACC teams. And in Michael's junior year, when he came out, I'm watching tape, and he stands out, like a sore thumb. With his athleticism, with how much better he had gotten from the time he entered North Carolina until his junior year. And when I was talking to Coach Smith after watching tape all day, he said to me that, and he would never say it publicly because, that's not the Carolina way, that Jordan was the most talented player that he had coached. And he said he's a really solid, good person on top of it. But he would never say that publicly.
But he said that to you, and how did that land How did that land with you when you heard him say something like that?
Well, I was a big advocate of Coach Smith. I thought he was a great coach.
Sure.
And I thought he prepared his players very well for the NBA. If you look at Carolina players over the course of time, and particularly when Coach Smith was there, most of his players were better pros than they were college players. There aren't many coaches you can say that about. Some coaches get everything as possible to get out of a player when he's in college, and then when you get him in pro ball, they don't improve that much. Most Carolina players under Coach Smith, and I think part of it was the way they played. They didn't put any one player above any other player. They played a very team-oriented game, and they really delved into the fundamentals of the game, and most of their players became better pros.
Rod Thorn here on the Rich Eisen Show, Basketball Hall of Famer. And then when you and the Bulls parted ways, you became the executive vice president of basketball operations. In other words, the league's chief disciplinarian, just at a time when the bad boys were hitting, and just at the time when people started hitting each other, and just at the time when really things were really getting particularly physical. Did you ever? What was your conversation with Chuck Daly like about his team, Lambeer, any of these guys? You ever have conversations like Lambeer and Mahorn saying, "What is your malfunction"? Did you ever have anything like that?
We had conversations with a lot of people, Rich, as you are alluding to. The game played in the late '80s and part of the '90s was much different than the game today. We instituted some changes during the '90s that really calmed the very, very physical play. You were allowed to hand check. Cutters got chucked all the time. If you drove to the bucket, you probably were going to get knocked down, if not upended. And the game had just got to a point where it was too physical. That strength and power were negating talent. And if you look at the NBA, most people would say the NBA their athletes are as good as any other sport, if not better. And if you are allowing extreme physicality in the game, which we had for a while, that's not a good thing for your game. And it changed with the flagrant foul rules, and then not allowing hand checking. And today it's a free flowing game, much different game than it was in the late '80s, early '90s. But it's the fans seem to like it a lot, and the physicality is not near what it was.
Well, I mean, part of the Last Dance that left so many people talking, Rod, was about the Bad Boy Pistons and the relationship between the Bad Boy Pistons and the Bulls, and thus obviously Michael Jordan and Isaiah Thomas. And I want to, I guess, revisit this issue with you since you were on charge of essentially selecting who played in the first major Dream Team in 1992. How did Isaiah Thomas not wind up on that team? I know you've been asked that many times over the last several weeks, but I'm the first time I get this shot. So how did he not wind up on that team?
You know, Rich, C.M. Newton, who was the athletic director at Kentucky at the time, was the chair of the committee.
Okay.
Russ Granick and myself, because we were NBA people and we were part of the committee,
right,
were asked by the committee to talk with the players who we had a meeting in Orlando, I want to say in early April of 1991, where we identified 5 or 6 players. I forget exactly what it was, but 5 or 6 players that we would, would be essential basically to have on the team. And Russ and I, contacted those people. Jordan was one of the guys that I contacted, out of that crew. And, those people agreed that they would participate on the team. Isaiah obviously was one of the guys that was looked at very closely. He was a tremendous player, one of the top point guards that we've had in the NBA. There were 5 or 6 other guys, James Worthy, Reggie Miller come to mind, Dominic Wilkins, Kevin Johnson, Tim Hardaway come to mind right away. And there were others that were looked at, and the committee, the committee had, on the Olympic team, you've got 12 players, of which 11 were pros. When you pick all-star teams, you've got 12 on each side, so you got 24 players. And, a lot of guys get left off that you could make a great case for. And in the case of the Dream Team, there were several people who got left off, prominently Isaiah, who I'm sure if he had been selected, would have been terrific. But the committee did not select him.
Is the reason why he was not selected that somebody said, I don't want him there? He can't be there because of what's gone on.
Not if you're alluding to a player, no, it had nothing to do with any player.
How about anybody?
Said anything to?
How about any commissioner?
To me, there were a lot of, there were when the Pistons walked out, didn't shake hands with the Bulls. At the end of the first year the Bulls won, I think it was 92, maybe 91, yes. 92, somewhere in there. There was some angst, among NBA people about, what had transpired. The Pistons, played a very, very physical game, which upset a lot of people. So there was some angst. I'm not going to tell you that there wasn't some angst, but obviously Chuck was the coach of the team, and although he didn't have anything to do with with picking, other than making talking about he had like 30 players that he felt we should consider, which we did. The committee did, but. No, there was no one player or 2 players or 3 players that I've read about who said to me or to Russ Granick, to my knowledge, that they didn't want to play with any particular player.
So would you say if Isaiah Thomas shook Michael Jordan's hand at the end of that Eastern Conference Finals right before the Dream Team selection, he would have made it in Barcelona? Would you say that?
I can't say that, Rich, but I think it would have helped. But I can't say that for sure. We had 11 people on the committee, of which Jack McCluskey was one of, who was the GM of the Pistons at the time. He later resigned from the committee when Isaiah wasn't selected, but he was part of that committee.
And so is that the reason why he resigned? Because Isaiah was not selected?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So it sounds like it was an interesting debate in that. Sounds like an interesting debate in that room went down, Rod. To me,
it was very. It was, it was, but it not only was, a debate regarding Isaiah, but there was a debate about other players.
What about Chris? What about Christian Laettner over Shaq, Rod? What about that one?
Well, we had agreed. The USA Basketball had asked the NBA if they would put one collegiate player on there because the collegiate players had represented the United States for so many years, and we agreed to it. A long time before Laettner was selected in May of 1992 after the season. Laettner had been a two-time Player of the Year. He had been a two-time champion with Duke, and the USA Basketball was pushing him because he had not only had a terrific career at Duke, but he had played for USA Basketball in every time they had asked him to play, he had played. Shaq was a younger player, and so Laettner, was the guy that got chosen there. Clyde Drexler at that same meeting, who had obviously had a great year with Portland, and they had played in the finals against Chicago, and he was the 12th guy selected.
Rod, last quick one for you, if you don't mind. Rod Thorn here on the Rich Eisen Show. You must know Jerry Reinsdorf very well, and obviously Jerry Krause was the man who succeeded you in the role in Chicago. A lot of discussion as to whose fingerprints were on the end of the last dance and why the team got broken up. Would Jerry Reinsdorf have ever let Krause do something on his own, or was Krause doing everything that Reinsdorf wanted him to do? Best you could tell.
I think that if you look at the record, you can't argue with the records. 6 championships. I think Krause made one of the great trades in the history of the league when he during the draft when he traded Olden Polynice for Scottie Pippen. Did some obviously did some really good things that helped that that particular group play as well as they did. So he deserved a lot of credit. I don't think he felt he got enough credit. And I think he was looking forward to rebuilding the team and hopefully making it into another, championship type team. It didn't work out that way, for the next 4 or 5 years. And then he was let go at the end of that. But I think he was looking forward to that.
Rod, really appreciate the time. Thank you for doing it, and let's chat down the road. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Right back at you. That's Rod Thorn, Basketball Hall of Famer. Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.